In this video, we're going to introduce the the modern model of macroeconomics as the field sees it. So a quick recap of where we've been and what we're doing. We introduced foundations, we introduced measurement. We're now firmly in the models section. We're actually on to the last model here. The first model is the early growth model, and then we have the Keynesian model, and finally we're on to the ASAD model. But I want to make a quick comment, right? We had the early growth model, and there were some things about macroeconomics that the early growth model couldn't handle, and the Keynesian model came along and said we need to think about the slack in the economy. Unfortunately, there's a new, I'll just call it an idea because it's not even a model, called modern monetary theory. And modern monetary theory tries to say, okay, monetary policy is driven by the same slack in the economy idea that we've got. So resource use driving monetary policy. That's wrong, and it's not even really a good model. It's not a model that economists take seriously. So if you hear that model, just dismiss that, ignore that model. That's not something that economists think is legitimate. We often argue about Keynesian macroeconomics and real business cycles and Austrian business cycle theory and these kind of things. Those are all discussions between legitimate models that have their strengths and weaknesses in the field debates. Modern monetary theory is not in that debate, and so we should treat it as such. Okay, so let's do the basics of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. This is the modern model, the current model of macroeconomics. It was built on aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And of course, we're familiar with supply and demand, but what's aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is the output of goods and services in real GDP demanded at different price levels. Okay, so just as we've done in all the other models, we want to build our model up. We want to understand why things in the model behave the way that they do. The first thing we want to think about is, why is it that aggregate demand slopes downward? Remember, we understood carefully why aggregate demand sloped downward in markets, in the individual market situation. We're just talking about demand, but there are three reasons, and they're somewhat different reasons than what we saw in market economies. Okay, the first is what we call the wealth effect, right? And the wealth effect is this idea that rising prices cut into real purchasing power of savings and financial assets. So as aggregate prices go up, the total amount that everybody demands goes down. Okay, the second is impact on exports. So if the U.S. price level goes up, then U.S. goods become more expensive in the global market, and therefore U.S. goods are less competitive, and thus demand for exports is lower, so the aggregate demand is lower. Finally, there's an interest rate effect. This is commonly phrased as interest rates are the price for using money. That's actually wrong, and we'll see this a lot more when we get to the lecture on money. Probably my favorite lecture in this whole class, honestly. But interest rates are actually the price for holding money. So not using it, but having it on hand. Why is that? Because there is an opportunity cost to not having your money put in the bank. So if it's in your wallet, whether you're spending it or holding it, whatever you're doing with it, it can't be then in the bank earning you interest. Okay, so this is the interest rate effect. The interest rate effect is simply that as prices rise, as aggregate prices in the economy rise, people will need more money for purchases. They'll have to hold more money, and therefore interest rates will go up, which reduces investment, and thus aggregate demand slopes downward because investment is a component of aggregate demand. Remember, investment is part of GDP, and aggregate demand represents the real GDP demanded. Okay. So, what are then the determinants? That's why aggregate demand slopes downward. What are the determinants of aggregate demand? What makes it have its shape and its space in the relationship between aggregate price and aggregate demand? Aggregate output. The first, obviously, is consumption. You'll actually recognize all these, right? Consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. I'll be quick about these because you're already comfortable with all of them. If one of the components of real GDP goes up, aggregate demand, of course, goes up. That's what you see in all of these. Now, consumption is the biggest driver. So that observation that Keynes made, that consumption is what's driving aggregate expenditure, it holds even in this model. So this is relatively straightforward stuff, so I won't linger on it. But consumption is the big driver of aggregate demand. And so we actually want to think about what determines consumer spending. So consumer spending is affected by 4 things. And these 4 things are wealth, consumer confidence, household debt, and taxes. All of this should look familiar. The Keynesian model informed this part of aggregate demand. So if our wealth is higher, then even regardless of what the price is, remember now we're doing prices instead of income, regardless of what the prices are, if wealth is up, consumption up. Now, consumer confidence is the one we've not met before. So people make decisions based on how they feel about the overall trajectory of the economy. Is the economy doing well? Then I'm more likely to spend. If the economy is doing poorly, then I will spend less. I'll save. I'll lower the amount that I'm spending in order to sort of hedge against a rainy day. So if consumer confidence up, consumption up. Household debt, of course, we've met this idea before. The more debt we have, the less consumption we can do. The more taxes there are, the less consumption we can have because our disposable income goes down. We have to pay for our taxes somehow. Notice that this is different than the paradox of thrift idea that we had in the previous lecture. Okay, again, aggregate demand increasing is represented as moving right because that means for the given price level, the amount of output demanded is higher, same as we met in the market model. Okay, so now let's turn to aggregate supply. Aggregate supply simply is the real GDP that firms will produce at varying price levels. Okay, but there's a real trick here, and this is what makes this model so different than everything we've seen before. We're actually going to differentiate between the short run, which is upward sloping, and the long run, which is perfectly vertical. Okay, so long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply. So the natural question you're going to be asking is, well, why is one of these things vertical and one of these upward sloping? In the short run aggregate supply is upward sloping because input costs slowly adjust, but in the long run, prices adjust perfectly, and so aggregate supply is at full employment. What that means is, well, quick note, full employment is shorthand in this model for full use of resources. We have full employment. We're saying we're fully using our capital goods, all of those things, right? So what we're saying is, in the short run, we can actually produce more beyond what our long-term capacity to produce is, beyond full employment, in the short run because prices take time to adjust. And then as they adjust, we reach the long run, there's only so much we can sustainably produce in the long run. Okay, so just a quick way to show this. Why is long run aggregate supply vertical and short run upward sloping but not vertical? If prices go up, we want to produce more. In the short run, that's possible, and that's why this curve slopes this way. In the long run, if prices go up, there's no more resources to tap into. There's no more resources to tap into, okay? So what we're saying is, in the short run, you can temporarily move beyond aggregate output 1, but that will feed back into the prices that the economy face, which will drive up input costs, meaning we will actually see there's this cap in the long run about what we can produce, right? This is like, think about it in your own personal life, right? There's an amount you can work in the short run, right? And so you say, it's finals week, I'll put in 100 hours of work this week, but you can't do that in the long run. So if the incentive, right? So let's turn the analogy to your work because this is very direct. We'll actually see this come back around later on in the lecture. Your work says, we'll give you an extra $1,000 this week in order to work 100 hours. And so you'll go above and beyond your 40, you'll go beyond 80, you'll work 100 hours this week. You could do that, right? And the increased price, the wages that you're going to earn, will incentivize you to do that. But you would not take a job that paid you $50,000 more a year, right, for you to do that extra work, $1,000 a week, all 50 weeks, $50,000 a year, if it meant you had to work 100 hours every week, right? So that's a way for us to show why can short run go beyond what we can do in the long run, right? Like there's things that are sustainable and there are things that are not. Okay, So in the same way, obviously that we had determinants of aggregate demand, we've got determinants of short-run aggregate supply. These are input prices, productivity, taxes and regulation, market power of firms and expectations. I quickly want to show us what that looks like to refresh our memory, right? That if input prices go up, short-run aggregate supply will go down. So short-run aggregate supply 1 is this curve here, and input prices go up, short-run aggregate supply will go down. Remember, with supply, we move left and right rather than up and down. This is the same reason as we met in the market model with price and quantity. So how do we know that? Here's the price. If the price is facing the higher supply curve, then we'll produce more. If we're facing the lower curve, we'll produce less. Okay, so this is a decrease in supply. Productivity, remember that we get this from the early growth model, right? It will actually increase short-run aggregate supply. Taxes and regulation, if you increase those, you will decrease the amount that you supply. If firms have more power, they will decrease the amount that they supply. This is an idea we actually retrieve from microeconomics on firm market power. So if you're taking a principles of micro and you get into firm behavior, they'll discuss this idea, but the basic idea is firms want to lower the amount that they produce so that they can charge higher prices so that they can make more profits. And then, of course, expectations, as we've met everywhere before, increase in supply. Now, in the same way that we have a determinants of short run, we can actually have determinants of long run. And in order to understand that, we have to understand that long run aggregate supply represents the full employment capacity of the economy. When we're producing at full employment, using all our resources, how much can we produce? Well, there's 3 ways. One is we can have more resources, right? So if we have a certain number of people, they can produce a certain amount. If we add more people, we can produce more. If we add more capital, we can produce more. The other way to do it, right, we should probably put like a star on this, obviously, is a change in productivity. This idea that we've met before. If we go and we're able to produce more with the same given resources, the total amount that we can produce in our full employment capacity increases. And then, of course, change in technology, which I've said elsewhere in this class, is actually somewhat similar to increase in productivity. We have new technologies that allow us to do more or different things with our resources. Okay, now let's add these 2 ideas together and talk about equilibrium. Okay, so I'm graphing my aggregate demand, my short-run aggregate supply, my long-run supply. When my short-run and my aggregate demand cross right here, we get short-run equilibrium. So short-run equilibrium happens between short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Notice that this is over here. It is not on the long-run aggregate supply curve. That's because long-run equilibrium is when all 3 of them cross. Okay, so notice short-run crosses, aggregate demand crosses, but the short-run equilibrium is here. So when the short-run equilibrium occurs on the long-run aggregate supply, that's when we have long-run equilibrium. And that's when all 3 lines neatly cross like so. Okay. We met the idea of the multiplier in the Keynesian model, right? But we want to highlight this idea that the actual effect of the multiplier is less in the ASAD model than in the Keynesian model because of this long-run curve. The spending multiplier works as long as the price level is stable. And this is true in the Keynesian model and the ASAD. It's just true, period, regardless of the model. As the economy moves up the SRAS curve, right? So as we move along the supply curve, the response to the aggregate spending is not as great. So spending goes up, but it moves along the supply curve, so that increase in spending that we see is reduced. The amount of output that it gets for each unit of spending goes down because each little unit of spending is met with increase in prices. And so our prices go and then sort of eat up some of that spending each round. Okay. When the economy reaches long-run equilibrium, reaches full employment, the multiplier can have no more effect because all of our increases in aggregate spending are completely reflected in prices. Let's see that happen here. So say we're here, right? We have an increase in spending over here to AD2. So we move along the supply curve. what happened? Prices went up and output went up. So did income go up? Absolutely yes, but it didn't go up like we see in the Keynesian model where it just shoots straight right? It's sort of, it goes up, but there's an increase in prices that offsets some of that income, right? However, when we reach here, if we continue to see increase in spending, what happens? There's no more movement right. We go straight up the long-run aggregate supply curve. So this yellow highlighted line here is a demonstration of what the spending effect looks like in our current ASAD model. So that's, remember what I was saying before, what's the observed government spending multiplier effect in the economy? Well, it's very poor, and that's because we're often around this intersection. We're not often way back here short of long-run aggregate supply. We're usually not in a recession. Okay, I digress. We're now going to turn to the two basic ways that we can see inflation in an economy. Okay, the first is what we call demand pull inflation, and the second is what we call cost push inflation. So demand pull inflation is when aggregate demand exceeds our long-run equilibrium, that's full employment. It exceeds that level of output. So temporarily, the economy can expand past full employment, right? But this increases costs and prices. So the economy is at full employment. Everybody wants to be employed, is employed, and the demand pushes past that point, and there's this strong signal, hey, we really want to produce more things in the short run to meet. So people work overtime, and people that were retired come back to work, and they begin to make money, right? So what does that look like? Well, first, we see aggregate demand. Well, before I do that, let's highlight this. What's happened here? Here, we're at the equilibrium output, and we have some initial level of prices. Okay, so this is long run equilibrium, just like we've seen before. Then, then demand increases. So this is that demand pull. Okay, and we push up to this higher level of aggregate output, which raises prices. Why? Because we have to lure those resources that don't really want to be employed, people, capital, etc., that it takes more than full employment to reach. But this has an important feedback loop, right? This is what we call overheating, right? So inflation takes some time to hit because we've overheated, but a feedback mechanism appears where if the prices go up, what happens on the business side of every market, of every industry? They look around and say, wow, we're having to pay more in order to get people because there's this overheating happening in the market. So what happens? The prices in the economy adjust upward to reflect that, right? It'd be like if your boss came to you and said, I need you to work 100 hours next week, I'll give you an extra $1,000. And you say yes. What happens if he comes back in 2 weeks and says, okay, I need you to work a second week of 100 hours, $1,000? You may or may not say yes. What happens if you show up for a third week? Well, now you're just paying me more, right? Now you just got to raise my base pay. I'm not doing this. If you want me to work a third week in a row of 100 hours, I need $2,000 instead of $3,000 bonus, right? And eventually there's some cap on that even, right? Like I can't ask you to work that rate indefinitely. At some point you will literally, there's no amount I can offer you to continue that pattern. That feeds back into supply actually decreasing. Why does supply decrease? Because remember, price went up here for the same level of output, right? We fed back those price mechanisms. Input prices go up. What's the eventual outcome? Well, we're right back here, but now we're all the way up here on prices. So what's the net effect when demand pushes past our full employment? We have an increase with a corresponding decrease in output, and we just have all this inflation where aggregate prices go up. Remember back to your inflation lesson. What's inflation? It's an increase in aggregate prices. That's what I'm showing you here. Nice, tidy way to do it. Okay, so recap. Demand shifts rightward. The economy overheats. Supply decreases. It shifts to the left because input prices have gone up. Remember, all the way back here, what determines supply? Input prices. Input prices up, aggregate supply down. So our aggregate output ends up unchanged, but our aggregate price is permanently higher. Permanently higher because we see our aggregate demand increase. We end up at the new aggregate output. Supply decreases. It drives us back to this point here. Prices are higher. Okay. What's the other type of inflation? The other type of inflation is probably, if you're familiar with any of them, this is the one you'd be familiar with, and that's cost push inflation. So something happens and we get a supply shock. Actually, again, let me do this. We're here at full employment, so I'm in long run equilibrium, and we have some initial price level. And then supply shock happens. A war sparks off between Russia and the Ukraine, and gas prices skyrocket, and we weren't expecting that, and supply goes down. Then aggregate output falls. So now we're in a different situation. We have prices going up, but instead of aggregate output going up, aggregate prices go up, but aggregate output goes down. Okay, so this is sort of an even worse situation in some ways. Now, what happens is when you're at this point, you're dealing with two things. This is inflation. This is unemployment. In fact, let me note that for you so you remember. This is what unemployment looks like. Right? This little gap here is unemployment. That is, this little gap is unemployment. This gap is inflation. Prices increase, inflation. Falling below our equilibrium full employment means we must have unemployment. So what happens? Well, there comes a point now where the government has to decide how it's going to react. If it enacts a stimulus, it can increase aggregate demand and drive us back to our equilibrium. So we'll get back here, call this AO2. We'll get back to, that's confusing. We get back to aggregate output, but now we're once again left with permanently higher inflation. Okay, so to recap, we get a supply shock, supply shifts left, the monetary authority has to engage in a stimulus in order to shift aggregate demand to the right. As a result, aggregate output is unchanged, aggregate prices permanently higher. So we end up with the same result as we had with demand. Okay, so the cost push inflation situation is very important. It highlights one of the most important ideas in economics. There are no solutions. There are only trade-offs when it comes to policy. Okay, so what's our policy perspective? We have an option when we are here. Let me highlight this point. When we reach this initial situation, right? So here's AD1. Here's the supply curve. There's supply curve 2. So we were right here, and we shifted back. Let me highlight that. Let me make that a different color so we can see it. Okay, we're at this position A here, right? Now we face something. We can either have inflation with lower unemployment. That is by, here, we'll color code it. I'll make that yellow. So make this one, that's not it. We'll make this one yellow. We can go this way. We can drive up to this point. That is inflation, as you see I've highlighted here. That's inflation along with lower unemployment. So let me notate that here. Like so. Alternatively, what can we do? We can go the other way. We can actually enact not a stimulus, but a contraction, and we can have higher unemployment with lower inflation, because the supply curve caused inflation and it caused unemployment. So we can either fight these two things, or we can actually drive them down. We can go this way, like I noted before, and we can end up here. What's interesting about here, it actually is lower inflation, but we trade that off by getting more unemployment. Okay, so no solutions, only trade-offs. Let's go ahead and take a look now. What would this look like if we analyzed the 2020 recession? So let's just say, which we really were, we were in full employment and we had some price level AP1. The pandemic hits. What happens when the pandemic hits? What happens when the pandemic hits? Well, it's going to drive aggregate demand down. It's going to drive aggregate supply down. What would those mechanisms be? Well, there's some obvious mechanisms there. People are less likely to want to go out and do business. That will drive down aggregate demand. People are getting ill. They're going to work less. Whatever's happening here, people even dying, right? Pandemic happens, and we see two things, right? Aggregate demand falls, right? So there's AD2. It's going to get messy because we've got a lot of things happening here, so just bear with me. And short-run aggregate supply, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to notate these new equilibrium points here, right? Because we've got short-run aggregate supply. We were here. Let me note the first one. This is the first equilibrium. Now, we have three options. Which equilibrium is the current real equilibrium? Well, it's AD2 right here, crossed with SRA2 right there, okay? So there's our next position, okay? So we don't expect there to actually be like inflationary pressure from the pandemic. Then along comes government action. They introduce shutdowns. Shutdowns have two very obvious effects. One, they have to lower aggregate demand. Why is that happening? Because people are not going out, they're not doing business, they're not purchasing things. Aggregate demand has to fall. At the same time, aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply has to fall down. We're doing less business. People are working less. They're literally being told to stay home and not work. So we're not engaged in business on either aspect. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to do this one quickly. There's no inflationary effect here, right? So the government is now sitting at what point? They're sitting at a point where we don't see inflationary pressure because we've had this huge drop, but we see resources, and this obviously fits, right? We see resources way, way below. I guess I should call it AO2. 1, 2. Way, way below what the economy is capable of. The economy slow down. It's coming. Okay? So along comes the government, the fiscal side of the government, and it says, let's introduce the CARES Act. Let's drive aggregate demand back up. Let's give people money. Let's encourage them to spend. This, of course, can't be short-run aggregate supply. It can only be an aggregate demand effect. So we'll actually move back, and we'll see that, and for the sake of cleanliness here, we're going to increase aggregate demand. What's going to happen? AD2 will now be also AD4. Where's the new equilibrium point? It's with the current short-run aggregate supply. So we recover some of our aggregate output, right? We're going to recover some of our aggregate output, like so, but we will also see, oops, that's sloppy. We'll also see an increase in prices. At the same time, what does the Federal Reserve do? The Federal Reserve comes along and engages in activity that puts more money into the economy, right? So basically what they do, they lower interest rates and they begin to buy assets to put on their balance sheet. We'll cover that way more in depth later on in the class. Again, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to say they drove that back to the original level, okay? This is stylized, right? So not trying to be perfect here. We're just trying to get a sense of what's happening. That will drive us to here. That will actually make a 1, so the first place that we kind of had a crash. now also be aggregate output 4. And we'll have our second price jump. Now, what's the problem is immediately after this, what did we see? We saw big time supply chain issues. That ripple effect of the shutdown, contracts, prices, everything rippling through the economy. What must have happened? We're actually going to see another crash in short run aggregate supply. Short run aggregate supply. Like so. We've got short run aggregate supply 4. Which leaves us with what position? Well, we have to remember, here's the supply curve that we're on, and we got all the way back to this aggregate demand. What will be the point? It will be this point here. As a result, up to 2 years after this recession, there was inflationary pressures, substantial inflation actually as far as we observed it, and not a full recovery.